Video game remakes have reached their zenith. These days, it feels like almost a third of the most anticipated new releases are either remasters or reimaginings of games from the 90s or 2000s. But video game remakes have been around since the beginning of gaming. In the 90s, they often came in the form of 16-bit upgrades to classic 8-bit games. But it wasn't until the 2000s that remakes really started popping off in high numbers. In fact, going through a list of them, I was actually really shocked at how many of them I had either forgotten about or just didn't know about in the first place. Because while remakes are often marketed as the definitive ways of playing games, as improvements over the original, most of the older ones have actually tended to fall to the wayside, failing to keep up with the originals in terms of cultural relevance. Though there are some exceptions, especially from Nintendo. Still, the 2000s was an odd time for remakes, and I want to look at some of these strange and less remembered ones from this period, as well as some from the early 2010s, so as to explore how the business of remakes has evolved, starting with the GameCube PS2 era, a time where the gaming market was very hot with success. At this point, new IPs were aplenty, and so there wasn't as much of an appetite for nostalgia. But at the same time, graphics and processing had progressed considerably, enough so that the idea of revisiting old ideas with better tech was inevitably something on developers' minds. Which is why so many of the remakes from this era were actually made by the same team or head creatives as the original games that they were based on, Resident Evil being a prime example. One of the handful of remakes to eclipse its original counterpart, this game is often held up as the gold standard of remakes, keeping the original's atmosphere but greatly enhancing it, and expanding upon and improving many of its ideas, all while keeping the original spirit intact. Which was probably actually something that came about pretty easily and organically, considering both games were directed by Shinji Mikami and released only 6 years apart. It's not exactly a tall expectation for a Resident Evil remake to recapture the magic of classic Resident Evil while you're still in the classic Resident Evil era. Which is why I think people holding this game up as a standard for remakes sets a bit of a false expectation. As if, for example, Bloober Team, the Polish devs who developed Silent Hill 2 Remake, were ever going to be able to capture the exact artistic energy as Team Silent, a group of Japanese devs from the early 2000s. It's just unfeasible. To achieve that, you need a case like Conker Live and Reloaded, which was developed by the same team that produced the original, Conker's Bad Fur Day, just 4 years earlier. Same team, same vibe. Live and Reloaded, despite some censorship of the original game and a few bad tweaks, is pretty much the same game, but improved over the original on pretty much every technical level. Better controls, better performance, better audio, etc. Yet oddly, despite being the better game, Live and Reloaded doesn't have half of the lasting pop culture legacy of Bad Fur Day, which highlights a core problem most remakes face, that no matter how much they enhance a game, like a joke told a second time, they just rarely are able to land with the same impact. This is especially true of Conker's Bad Fur Day, which relied heavily on the novelty of being a surprisingly raunchy and for mature game on a console overrun with family-friendly content, while Live and Reloaded felt far less subversive on the young adult-oriented Xbox. Which is why I kind of appreciate remakes which, for better or for worse, try to do something new. Metal Gear Solid: The Twin Snakes provided the same core experience as the original, but with jacked up Matrix-esque cutscenes and MGS2 style gameplay. Yeah, it is by most votes the inferior game, but at least it sustains interest by being a unique curiosity. Similarly, Kingdom Hearts Chains of Memory for PS2 is essentially the original GBA game, but in full 3D. It's the same experience but from a completely new perspective. Literally. It's an alternative rather than a replacement. And that's a way you can describe a lot of remakes from this era. It's the mantra that informed the next weird remake trend that popped up in the 2000s, PSP and DS remakes, which there are a surprisingly high number of. More than anything, I feel like these were games that were made just because the developers could. After all, the DS and PSP were the first handhelds that could properly handle fluid 3D graphics, So what better way to test that than by porting over old games from the previous generation? And maybe because there wasn't as big of a divide in graphical performance, you can tell that these games weren't meant to be replacements or superior versions of the originals. As such, they tend to deviate and experiment in weird ways. Diddy Kong Racing, which I think most don't even realize was on DS, replaced half the races with these weird touch control mini-games, among many other gimmicky revisions and features. Medieval completely reworked the original game with a new Tim Burton-esque art style and tone, which felt pretty at odds with the original, on top of tons of restructured levels and added minigames and bosses. Ape Escape on the Loose decided to be a remake of a dual analog game on a console with only one analog stick. Not sure why they didn't think that one through, but here it is. Even Nintendo went full whack mode with Mario 64 DS, having you start the game with Yoshi instead of Mario and adding all sorts of other weird content. In 2025, it's kind of an unthinkable thing. Nintendo has become so conservative with their remakes, and Mario 64 has become such a massive game in gaming culture, that it's hard to even fathom anybody daring to change it in such significant ways. And while most of these games have understandably been kind of swept under the rug, I still think they endure by virtue of being cool novelties, which is less true of some of the 2D remakes. Castlevania Dracula X Chronicles, Maverick Hunter X, Prince of Persia Classic, all solid to great games, but all of them have kind of disappeared from the conversation on account of just being kind of less famous versions of certified classics. They almost kind of feel more like the types of ports you'd see in the 80s and 90s, where a game would get ported to a different console, but because back then the hardware between them was so different, every version of the game was basically a new original experience. Like, both of these may say Mega Man 3, but the one on the right was essentially a fresh experience made from scratch. In a way, these were the original remakes. And a game that I really like that almost intentionally captures this style is Mega Man Powered Up. A remake of the original Mega Man, a game that, unlike Maverick Hunter X, doesn't try to be faithful at all to the original, and instead presents all kinds of new stages and content. Just like the classic Game Boy ports, Mega Man is much larger and the stages are much more compact. And I wish this game was remembered more, as this is the type of remake I really love from this era. Remakes that had no pretense and were just trying to be neat homages. Because while rarely explicit, I sometimes feel as though modern remakes have a sort of pomp to them. Like they are, by virtue of having more technically advanced graphics, inherently superior to their original counterparts. Like, I get most devs probably don't consciously think that way when they're remaking a game, but that does feel like the cultural assumption most normal people operate with. Like, many times I've told friends that I was starting a playthrough of a classic game, only to be met with a confused look and the question, why not just play the new remake instead? But that sort of attitude came a bit later. And while the PS3 360 era didn't see remakes fully adopt that mentality, and didn't see them grow into quite the beast they are today, they did start to become a lot more prevalent. Though unfortunately, it's also here where I do think they started to take on a more cynical tone. The GoldenEye remake for Wii sticks out in my mind as being one of the first times I personally remember seeing nostalgia used as a marketing ploy for a major release. While games like the Twin Snakes offered the chance to play a fun, alternative version of a classic game, here it felt like they were selling people on a chance to relive their favorite game. Even though GoldenEye Remake was nothing like the original, but was really more just a standard 360 era shooter with a thin GoldenEye veneer. You saw something similar with the terrible TMNT Turtles in Time Reshelled, which on top of just being kind of a cheap and crappy game in general, didn't capture any of the spirit of the original. It marketed itself to 80s and 90s kids as a return to the classic experience, while at the same time ditching the classic TMNT art style for something more in line with the 2003 TV show to appeal to 2000's kids. Reimaginings are fine, but you can't have your cake and eat it too, and trying to simultaneously pander to two opposing groups at the same time rarely works out. For example, Silent Hill Shattered Memories is a very, very loose reimagining of the original Silent Hill. It's a cool and unique game unlike anything else in the series, and really shouldn't be considered a remake at all. If you've played both, you'll know why. But because the marketing team at Konami pulled the nostalgia bait trick, fans went into Shattered Memories with false expectations and ended up mostly disliking it. It's been in the last bunch of years that people have started to really come around on it and appreciate it on its own terms. And I think early blunders like this are why reimaginings today, even ones which completely drift away from the original gameplay-wise, tend to come across as though they're very conscious of fan expectations. Which, in a way, is good, but it does kind of make me yearn for the days where fans were a little bit less touchy. As I feel like something like Mario 64 DS would be reacted to much more negatively had it been released today, since by now there's more of a set precedent. And maybe it should be like that, because while I love wacky experimental remakes, there are also a lot of remakes that change things in a way that isn't really unique or interesting, but is just kind of worse. Like Ninja Gaiden Sigma, which I think most would agree is just a worse version of Ninja Gaiden Black. While there are some good changes in there, there's a lot of removed content and a lot of unnecessary alterations and additions, which wouldn't be a problem if Ninja Gaiden Black was as readily available as Sigma. In fact, Sigma is probably an example of a remake that is more well remembered today just by virtue of being the more easily accessible to buy game, a sad reality for many classics. And it's a sad thing for me especially, because if I want to play a game, 9 times out of 10 I'll play the original. While there are lots of remakes I prefer over the original, I think playing a game in its original context will always provide the purest and most interesting version of that experience. But at the same time, I want some enhancements as well, which is why I actually love the trend that started in the early 2010s of HD collections, at least the good ones. Like, on top of usually just being tasteful enhancements that didn't try too hard to be flashy, they usually came in collections and were just a really good deal. Yet, while this trend started here, it was also during this time that we started to see more and more of the built from the ground up style remasters, like Tony Hawk Pro Skater HD and Tomb Raider Anniversary. 2 games I never even knew existed and which helped inspire this video, as I think these are games that fell into 2 of the major pitfalls that remakes often do. While Tomb Raider Anniversary is actually one of the mechanically stronger Tomb Raider games, to me, it just emanates an aura of fatigue. Like with Pro Skater HD, both came out during a point in their franchise's histories where sales were dwindling and their formulas were getting tired. And with both, you can just sense that the devs weren't as enthused anymore, especially given the fact that the project they were working on wasn't even a fresh original sequel, but a remake. And I think that is a big problem with remakes. They are just inherently staler products, and that hinders the creative magic that all great games rely on. Like, I know from personal experience how creatively energizing it is when I get a great, fresh idea in my head, and more ideas just start popping off in my mind. And in great games, you can always sense that energy. And God bless them, a lot of them are really well made, but I rarely feel that energy from remakes, at least not on the same level. Like, I'm sorry, but the team remaking Snake Eater Delta are just never going to be tapping into the same spark as the original team. Because 1, they don't have the same creative agency that good artists rely on, and 2, because they're making something that already exists, and that's just inherently less exciting. Look at Tomb Raider Original. In spite of its very rough mechanics, I think it was a game that captured a legitimate feeling of adventure, awe, and discovery. It felt like a game that was excited to exist. While comparatively, Anniversary, in spite of its strengths, feels as though it's just sort of going through the motions. A problem that Tony Hawk HD in particular highlights is the fact that, while it was made to be an upgraded version of the original, it too ended up looking incredibly of its time as well, being maybe the most 360-ass looking game I've ever seen. And as a result, it almost looks worse than the original. Like, I think a great example of this is Crash Insane Trilogy. I feel like with each passing day, Insane Trilogy looks more and more like a game from 2017, in a bad way. Though I think the original looks like a PS1 game in an endearing way. While it's a more technically limited game, to my eyes, it's the better crafted product. And I think that's an important distinction. Good graphics versus good craftsmanship. Naughty Dog has always been a beast of a developer when it comes to graphics. They've always been top of their field in terms of visual presentation. Whereas Toys for Bob, developer of the Insane trilogy, have always made good but unexceptional looking games. So what Naughty Dog lacked in tech, they made up for it with craftsmanship. The best graphics of 1998 versus decent graphics from 2017. I think the former looks better. And this was even a thing in 2000's remakes. While Twin Snakes may have the higher polygon count in the PS1 game, I don't know, it just looks flatter and less stylish to me. And while I'm not going to put Pro Skater 1 on a pedestal, I do think the original is the more charming and endearing looking game. And this may be because Tony Hawk HD was a cheaper Xbox Live release the devs clearly didn't take super seriously, but who knows how the newer remake will hold up visually in 15-20 years. It's hard to say without hindsight. But it's not like the risk of remakes themselves becoming obsolete was ever going to stop them from remaking games. With the shift to HD graphics, an increasing number of remakes was inevitable. While the graphical leap between PS1 and PS2 was huge, the jump from analog to HD was consequential in a deeper way, as it created a rift in visual presentation. HD games just have a particular look, and while PS1 and PS2 games both look good on a CRT, they both had their flaws very exposed on an HD monitor. And with widescreen becoming a new standard, it's no surprise remake releases started picking up around this time. Though some games got a little bit ahead of themselves on the whole HD thing. Super Street Fighter 2 HD Remix, for example, is a really bad looking game that decided to redraw all of the original sprite work from Super Street Fighter 2 by hand. The result looks decent in images, but just wrong in motion. Somehow the sprite work in the original never felt choppy, but when hand-drawn, the stuttering is on full display. It was just an unnecessary change. Thankfully, these days people appreciate sprite animation, but in 2008 when this had released, it was still a very niche style. Retro game appreciation and nostalgia is super common today. Half of the industry is built off of it with the constant re-releases. But in the 360 era, I remember most people would be a little taken aback if you told them you played older games from past console generations. And while that's been a lot more normalized, echoes of that attitude still exist, as while most people will play older games, they'll still generally look down on the original if a remake exists. And while I don't begrudge any individual remake, I really don't like the overprevalence of them, and I don't like the attitude I think they sometimes signify. That tendency for people to look at quirks of older games as flaws to be fixed rather than as features, as I think those quirks tend to be what make a game endearing. Like so many people view the rigid controls of Resident Evil 4 not as an intentional design choice, but as jank, a sentiment that RE4 remake devs at the very least enabled by switching to a far looser control scheme. With the mid-2010s rolling in, you started to see more games not just try to recreate an older release, but also fix them. Majora's Mask 3D wasn't just a fun alternative way to play Majora's Mask, but was a version that attempted to amend all of the supposed errors from the original, which in my opinion resulted in a less unique game with overall worse mechanics, tone, and boss fights, more in line with the bad design standards of Nintendo's bland era. But perhaps games like Majora 3D are the exceptions. While I do have a lot of appreciation for older remakes, it's overall a more refined art at this point. But I do think the tendency for remakes to fall behind the original in terms of legacy will probably not be going anywhere, just as it is the case with movie remakes. Truly original creations are always just going to have a captivating spark to them, and that's a difficult thing to imitate. So, while remakes are cool, they're not a substitution for original works. So please, game industry, start making good shit again.